Everyone sees Morty as the scared kid just trying to survive Rick's chaos. He panics, he cries, he begs to go home. The internet calls him the good one, the moral center of the whole family. A coroner looking at Morty's body count would call him something else entirely. In this video, we break down every single person Morty has ever killed. Section 1. Crumbopulous Michael. Morty Smith has killed a lot of things by the time the series is finished. Bugs, monsters, soldiers, parasites, and even people he cared about have all met their end because of something he did. But the very first person Morty ever kills is not a monster or a villain in a cape. He is a cheerful, well-dressed alien with a friendly voice and a job to do. His name is Crumbopulous Michael, and the way he dies says more about who Morty is at the start of this show than almost anything else that happens to him. To understand how Morty ends up killing an assassin by accident, it helps to understand what kind of morning this actually started as. The episode is called Morty Night Run, and it opens with something that feels almost normal for this family. Rick decides it is time to teach Morty how to drive the flying ship they use for their trips through space. This is presented as a big step for Morty, since up until this point, Rick has always been the one behind the controls. Morty is excited and nervous at the same time, gripping the wheel while Rick barks instructions at him the way any impatient teacher might. It is a small domestic moment tucked inside a science fiction cartoon, and it matters because it shows Morty is not naturally skilled at flying this thing. He is still learning. He still makes mistakes. That detail becomes important very soon. While Rick is walking Morty through the basics, they discover Jerry hiding in the back seat of the ship. Jerry has been struggling to find his place in the family, and in this moment, he is desperate enough to stow away just to feel included in whatever Rick and Morty are doing. Rick's solution is not exactly warm. He takes Jerry to a strange facility built specifically to hold different versions of Jerry from other timelines, a kind of daycare center for men just like him. It is a place designed by another Rick from a different reality, built for exactly this purpose. And it tells you everything about how replaceable Jerry is treated within this family, and within the wider multiverse the show exists in. Rick drops him off without much guilt, and turns his attention back to the actual reason he wanted the ship out in the first place. That reason turns out to be money. Rick has a side deal running, and it involves selling weapons. Specifically, he has built and sold a very powerful gun, one capable of killing a life form that cannot normally be destroyed by regular means. The buyer is a gray-skinned alien, wearing a sharp suit and speaking with unusual politeness for someone in his line of work. This alien introduces himself as Crumbopulous Michael. He explains, almost with a shrug, that being an assassin is just something he does for a living, a job like any other, except his job happens to involve ending lives. He says it with a kind of chipper energy that makes the whole exchange feel less like a criminal deal and more like a coworker talking about their day at the office. Morty is standing right there for this entire conversation, and it clearly bothers him. He watches his grandfather hand over a weapon built for one purpose, knowing exactly what that purpose is. And he watches Crumbopulous Michael accept it with the same casual attitude someone might use to pick up a sandwich order. Morty asks Rick, more or less, whether he understands what he just did. He wants to know if Rick realizes that he is now directly responsible for arming someone who is about to go kill another living being. Rick brushes the question off. His reasoning is simple and selfish. He needed money, and this was an easy way to get it. He plans to take his earnings straight to Blips and Chits, which is essentially an enormous alien arcade, something like an intergalactic version of a family entertainment center back on Earth. There is a specific game inside called Roy, a fully immersive simulation that lets a person live an entire pretend lifetime as an ordinary man named Roy, complete with a boring job, a family, and a slow decline into old age. Rick is drawn to it because it lets him disappear into someone else's uneventful existence for a while, a strange kind of escape for a man who claims to find normal life pointless. This is where the emotional core of the episode really starts to take shape. Morty is upset that Rick sold a weapon to a professional killer just to fund an arcade trip. He tries to bring it up again, hoping his grandfather will show even a small amount of remorse. Instead, Rick treats the whole situation as settled and heads inside to spend his new alien currency on games. Morty is left standing there, stewing in his own frustration, feeling like the one person in this equation who actually cares about the fact that someone is about to die because of a deal his own family member made for pocket change. Morty makes a decision in this moment that defines almost everything that happens next. He decides he cannot just stand by and let this happen. He is going to stop Crumbopulous Michael before he can carry out the hit he was just paid and armed to perform. It is a genuinely good instinct. Morty wants to save a life. He wants to prove that not everyone in his family treats death as something you can just shrug off for entertainment money. The problem is that Morty does not yet have the skill, the experience, or the composure to actually pull off a rescue mission like this. He just finished his very first driving lesson a few scenes earlier. He is still shaky behind the controls of a ship that moves fast and responds to the smallest touch. Determined anyway, Morty climbs into the ship on his own, without Rick, and takes off after Crumbopulous Michael, who is already on his way to complete the job he was hired for. This is the turning point of the whole section, and it is worth slowing down to really picture what is happening. A 14-year-old boy, barely trained, alone in a spacecraft, chasing down a professional killer through unfamiliar territory, all because his conscience would not let him sit still. It is brave in a way. It is also incredibly reckless, though not in the sense of thrill-seeking. Morty is not doing this for excitement. He is doing it because he believes it is the right thing to do. And that belief is strong enough to override every bit of common sense that might normally stop a kid from doing something this dangerous. What happens next unfolds fast. Morty catches up to Crumbopulous Michael right as the assassin is closing in on his target. Morty is trying to fly the ship in a way that will block him, disrupt him, do anything to stop the hit from happening. But his piloting is clumsy. He overcorrects. He misjudges distance and speed the way any brand new driver might misjudge things on a busy road for the first time. Instead of cutting Crumbopulous Michael off or scaring him away, Morty crashes directly into him with the ship. The impact is immediate and lethal. Crumbopulous Michael, the same alien who just minutes earlier was cheerfully explaining that killing people is simply his profession, is killed instantly by a boy who is only trying to prevent a killing from happening at all. There is a sharp and painful irony sitting right at the center of this moment, and it does not need to be explained out loud, because the scene itself makes it obvious. Morty set out to stop a murder and ended up committing one himself without ever meaning to. He did not pull a trigger. He did not plan any of it. He simply flew a ship he barely understood into another living being while trying to do something he believed was good. That gap between intention and outcome becomes one of the most important ideas running through this entire episode, and honestly, through a huge amount of the show as a whole. Good intentions do not guarantee good results. Sometimes they lead to the exact opposite of what a person hoped for. Morty's reaction in the immediate aftermath is not triumphant. There is no sense of victory or relief on his face. Instead, there is shock. He sits there, staring at what just happened, processing the fact that he has now killed someone, something he never imagined himself doing even a few minutes earlier when he was arguing with Rick about the morality of selling weapons. The line between the boy who was upset about someone else enabling violence and the boy who just caused a death himself has been crossed almost instantly. And Morty barely has time to catch his breath before the situation escalates even further. Because Crumbopulous Michael was not working alone in that moment, there is a guard nearby, someone connected to the job Michael was there to finish. And this guard turns on Morty almost immediately, ready to kill him in retaliation or simply to eliminate a witness. Morty is defenseless at this point, stunned from the crash and completely unprepared for a direct physical threat. This is the moment Rick chooses to show up. He arrives through a portal at exactly the right second, and rather than trying to talk his way out of the situation or diffuse things peacefully, he cuts the guard down instantly, slicing him in two as he steps through. It is fast, brutal, and treated by Rick with almost no emotional weight at all. For Rick, this is simply what happens when you go looking for trouble. He does not scold Morty. He does not comfort him. He barely reacts to the fact that his grandson just killed someone for the first time in his life. He just moves on to the next problem, because for Rick, death is background noise, something that happens constantly across infinite universes and therefore does not deserve much attention. This contrast between Rick's numbness and Morty's shock is one of the clearest ways this section defines who these two characters are. Rick has seen so much death across so many realities that one more body barely registers. Morty has not. For Morty, this is the very first time he has taken a life. And even though it happened by accident, even though his goal was to prevent harm rather than cause it, the weight of it does not disappear just because his reasons were good. He is left standing in the wreckage of his own attempt to do the right thing, having caused exactly the kind of death he was trying to stop. What makes this moment land even harder is that Krombopulos Michael was never actually painted as evil in any dramatic sense. He was polite. He was almost likable in a strange way, treating his job with the same tone someone might use to talk about being an accountant or a delivery driver. He never threatened Morty directly. He never did anything cruel on screen before his death. He was simply doing the job he was hired and equipped to do, a job that existed only because Rick decided to make some quick money. In a lot of ways, Krombopulos Michael is a victim of two separate decisions that had nothing to do with malice on his end. Rick decided selling a weapon was worth the cash. Morty decided stopping that weapon's use was worth risking everything. Krombopulos Michael just happened to be standing in the middle of both of those choices when they collided, quite literally, in the shape of a crashing ship. This section of the story also sets up something that becomes a running idea across the whole episode, and honestly, across a lot of the series. Morty wants to be a good person. He wants to believe that stepping in, taking action, and refusing to look away from wrongdoing will lead to positive outcomes. But this show keeps testing that belief in painful ways. Here, right at the start, Morty's first attempt to prevent harm results in him accidentally causing exactly the kind of harm he was trying to stop. It is not a punishment handed down by some outside force. It is simply what happens when good intentions run into inexperience, chaos, and bad timing all at once. There's also something worth noticing about how casually the show treats this death compared to how seriously Morty experiences it internally. The other characters barely pause. Rick kills the guard without hesitation and shows no interest in discussing what Morty just went through emotionally. The show moves forward at a brisk pace, almost daring the audience to keep up, rather than pausing to dwell on the moral weight of what just happened. Yet, through Morty's face, his silence, and his clear discomfort, the audience is given all the signals needed to understand that this moment actually matters to him, even if nobody around him treats it that way. By the time the dust settles from this crash, Morty has learned something that will follow him for the rest of the episode and, honestly, for a long time afterward. Trying to prevent a killing does not automatically make someone innocent of causing one. Being the person who cares the most in a room full of people who do not care at all does not protect a person from making things worse. Krombopulos Michael dies not because he was targeted, not because Morty hated him, and not because there was any kind of plan behind it. He dies because a scared, well-meaning, barely trained boy tried to stop something bad from happening and ended up becoming the exact thing he was trying to prevent. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of this stops the story here, though. Because once the dust settles and Rick finishes dealing with the guard, Morty is introduced to the very person Crombopulous Michael was sent to kill in the first place. This stranger is unlike anything Morty has encountered before, and the choice Morty makes about what to do with this being, someone he now feels responsible for protecting after everything that just happened, is about to send the rest of this night spiraling into something even more dangerous than anything that has happened so far. Section 2. Fart. Right after the crash that killed Crombopulous Michael, Morty is introduced to the person that assassin was hired to kill. This is where the second death of the episode begins to take shape, and it plays out in almost the exact opposite way the first one did. The first death was fast, accidental, and over before Morty even understood what he had done. This one builds slowly, over the course of an entire night, and by the end of it, Morty is fully aware of what he is doing and why. There is no confusion this time. There is only a choice, made with open eyes, and it changes something in Morty that never fully goes back to how it was before. The being Crombopulous Michael was sent to kill has no name at first. It is a gaseous life form, something without a solid body, in the way Morty or Rick have one. It communicates through telepathy, meaning it can put thoughts and feelings directly into another person's mind, rather than speaking out loud. When Morty first meets this creature, still shaken from what just happened with the assassin, he asks for a name. The being does not really have one, since its species does not seem to use names the way people on Earth do. Rick, never missing a chance to be blunt or a little rude, makes a crude joke about the sound the being makes, and from that joke, the name Fart is born. It sticks for the rest of the night, and it stays surprisingly fitting for a character who ends up being far more complicated than the silly name suggests. At this point, Morty is already carrying the weight of one death he never intended. He is desperate for this next part of the night to go differently. He wants to do something right, something that actually helps rather than harms. Freeing Fart and getting him safely back to wherever he came from feels like exactly that kind of chance. Rick is far less interested. He has just lost the buyer for his weapon and the alien who was going to pay him to look the other way while a hit took place. From his perspective, this whole situation has already turned into a mess, and helping Fart escape captivity only adds more risk and more work to a night that was supposed to be simple. Still, Morty insists, and Rick, grumbling the entire way, agrees to help, mostly because arguing with Morty at this point would take more energy than just going along with it. The escape does not go smoothly. As soon as they try to move Fart away from where he was being held, government forces notice and start chasing them. This is not a small chase either. It becomes a full-blown pursuit through the streets, with armed vehicles closing in and gunfire breaking out. Civilians who happen to be nearby get caught in the crossfire, and several of them die during the chaos. These deaths are not something Morty causes directly with his own hands, but they only happen because Morty chose to interfere with Crombopulous Michael's job in the first place, setting off a chain of events that led straight to this street battle. Rick makes sure Morty understands this connection. At one point during the chase, Rick turns to him and asks how he feels about all the people getting killed today because of the choices he made. It is not asked gently. It is meant to sting, and it does. This moment matters a lot for understanding where Morty's head is at during the rest of the episode. He is not just carrying guilt over one accidental death anymore. He is watching innocent bystanders get caught in gunfire that would never have happened if he had simply let the night play out the way Rick originally planned it. Morty's instinct to do good, the same instinct that made him chase down an assassin a few scenes earlier, is now directly tied to a growing pile of collateral damage. He wanted to save one life and ended up putting many others at risk in the process. This is the second time in one night that Morty's good intentions have produced consequences far uglier than anything he imagined when he first decided to act. Despite all of this, Morty does not give up on Fart. If anything, the danger and the deaths around him only make him more determined to see this through, as if finishing what he started might somehow justify everything that has already gone wrong. They manage to escape the immediate chase and make their way to the workshop of a mechanic everyone calls Gearhead, hoping to get their damaged ship repaired before continuing the journey. While the repairs are happening, Fart does something that becomes one of the most memorable moments of the entire episode. He begins to sing, projecting the song directly into Morty's mind, along with a strange, colorful vision that plays out like a music video only Morty can see. The song carries a message about unity, about everyone being connected, about letting go of pain and fear. It is calm, strange, and oddly beautiful, and it gives Morty a genuine emotional connection to this creature he has spent the whole night protecting. That connection matters because it is the thing that makes the ending of this section hurt as much as it does. Morty is not just protecting a stranger out of principle anymore. He has bonded with Fart. He has spent hours risking his life, watching people die around him, and pushing through fear and exhaustion, all to help a being who now feels like something close to a friend. This is exactly the kind of emotional setup the show likes to build before pulling it apart, and Morty Night Run does not waste the opportunity. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Gearhead turns out to be far less trustworthy than he seemed. Rather than simply fixing the ship and letting them go, he contacts the authorities, hoping to hand over Fart in exchange for some kind of reward or protection. This forces another chase, another burst of danger, another reminder that nothing about this night is going to be simple. Fart, however, is not entirely helpless. His species has an ability tied to altering the basic makeup of matter itself, which gives him a strange kind of power over machines and materials around him. Using this ability, Fart causes a chain reaction of crashes among the pursuing vehicles, creating enough chaos for Rick, Morty, and Fart to slip away and continue toward the location where Fart can finally return home through a wormhole leading back to wherever his people live. This is where the emotional tone of the episode shifts hard. Up until this point, the story has painted Fart as a gentle, wrongly persecuted being, someone who never deserved to be hunted by an assassin in the first place. Morty has spent this entire night believing that saving Fart was the one clearly good thing to come out of all this chaos. As they finally reach the wormhole, with the danger behind them and the goal in sight, Fart begins to explain what he and his people actually plan to do once he gets home. He tells Morty, calmly and without any hint of malice in his tone, that his species intends to return to this dimension and cure it. The word cure sounds harmless on its own, almost kind, but the meaning behind it is anything but. What Fart's people consider a disease is carbon-based life itself, the very kind of life that makes up humans, animals, and nearly everything Morty has ever known. Their plan is not medical treatment in any normal sense. It is the complete elimination of every carbon-based life form in this dimension, framed by Fart's people as an act of mercy rather than destruction. Fart explains this the same way he might explain any other plan, without raising his voice, without seeming to understand that what he is describing amounts to wiping out entire populations, including humanity. Morty is horrified. Everything he did over the course of this night, every risk he took, every death that happened around him because of his choices, was in service of protecting someone who now openly admits he intends to help erase all carbon-based life once he gets back to his own people. Morty is not just disappointed. He realizes in this single moment that he has spent an entire night unknowingly assisting in what amounts to preparation for a massive act of destruction. The friend he made, the being he connected with through that strange telepathic song only a short while earlier, is revealed to be something far more dangerous than anything Crumbopolis Michael ever was. Fart does not seem to grasp why this information would upset Morty. From his point of view, he has simply told the truth about his people's intentions, expecting Morty to understand or even agree with the reasoning behind it. He appears confused by the shift in Morty's expression, unaware that what feels like a simple explanation to him lands as devastating news to someone who has just risked his safety and peace of mind to protect him. Faced with this information, Morty makes the second major decision of the episode, and this one carries none of the confusion or accident that defined the death of Krombopolis Michael earlier. Morty asks Fart to sing for him one more time, the same way he did back at Gearhead's shop. Fart agrees, beginning the song again, drifting into that same calm and hopeful tone, unaware of what is about to happen. While Fart is distracted by his own singing, fully trusting Morty in that moment, Morty raises the same antimatter weapon that Krombopolis Michael once carried, the exact gun Rick sold to that assassin at the very start of the night, and shoots Fart, killing him instantly. This is not an accident. This is not a misjudged flight path or a panicked reaction to a sudden threat. Morty chooses this. He understands exactly what he is doing and why he is doing it. Fart represents a threat to every carbon-based life form Morty has ever known, including his own family, and Morty makes the call to end that threat before it can be carried out. It is a decision built entirely on the information Fart himself just handed over, delivered without any awareness of how it would be received. There is something quietly devastating about the way this scene is built. The same gun that indirectly caused the death of Krombopolis Michael, the gun Rick sold purely for personal gain, ends up being the weapon Morty uses to prevent something far worse than anything that assassin was ever hired to do. The night comes full circle in a strange and uncomfortable way, tying the accidental death at the start of the episode to the intentional one at the end, both connected by the same object passing from one hand to another. Fart's death lands differently than Krombopolis Michael's did, and it should, because the circumstances are completely different. This time, Morty is not shocked by what just happened in the way he was after the crash earlier in the night. There is no confusion on his face. Instead, there is a kind of hollow stillness, the look of someone who understands exactly what they just did and is already carrying the full weight of it. He does not celebrate stopping a potential mass extinction. He does not seem relieved that he made the right call. He simply stands there, having just killed someone he had genuinely come to care about, someone who trusted him enough to sing with his guard completely down in his final moments. Rick's reaction afterwards says a lot about how differently the two of them process what just happened. Rick does not offer comfort. He does not praise Morty for making a difficult but necessary choice. Instead, he takes the opportunity to mock him, pointing out the contradiction in Morty's behavior throughout the night. Someone who spent hours insisting that killing is wrong and that saving lives matters more than anything else, only to end the night by pulling the trigger himself. Rick treats this less like a moment of growth and more like proof that morality is messy and inconsistent, no matter how strongly someone believes in it. Morty does not argue back. He does not defend himself. He simply stares blankly into the distance as they leave the world where Fart died, offering no reaction at all to Rick's jabs. What makes this section stand apart from the death of Krombopolis Michael earlier in the episode is the complete presence of choice. Morty did not stumble into this outcome through inexperience or bad timing. He weighed the situation, understood the stakes, and made a decision to take a life he believed was necessary to prevent something far larger and far worse. This is Morty's first fully intentional kill in the entire series, carried out not with anger or panic, but with a strange kind of tearful resolve, using a song as cover so that the last thing his friend experienced was comfort rather than fear. By the end of this night, Morty has caused one death through pure accident and committed a second through deliberate choice, both happening within the space of a single adventure that started as nothing more than a driving lesson gone slightly wrong. The emotional gap between the two deaths says a lot about how quickly circumstances can shift once violence enters the picture, and how difficult it becomes to hold on to simple ideas about right and wrong once someone is standing in the middle of a situation with no easy answers left. Rick eventually tries to spin the entire ordeal into a kind of moral lesson, suggesting that, whether Morty admits it or not, he has learned that pretending things do not matter, or pretending killing is always wrong, does not hold up once real stakes are involved. Morty does not respond to this either. There is no clean resolution here, no tidy lesson delivered with a smile. Just a quiet ride home, a boy carrying 2 deaths in one night, and a grandfather who sees the whole thing as just another Tuesday. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This night at least ends there, but the consequences of Rick's carelessness on this same evening are far from finished. Because while everyone was busy chasing an assassin and rescuing a doomed alien, Rick made one more small decision earlier in the episode that seemed completely unimportant at the time, something so minor it barely registered against everything else happening around it. That decision is about to come back in a way nobody saw coming, and it has nothing to do with guns, assassins, or gaseous beings at all. Section 3. The Cronenberg Earth Catastrophe. Every death Morty causes across this show carries its own kind of weight, but nothing compares to what happens because of one simple request he makes before a school dance. This is not a story about a fight, a chase, or a weapon. It starts with a boy who just wants a girl to like him back. By the end of it, an entire planet full of people has been turned into monsters, and Morty and his grandfather have walked away from their whole family, replacing them with corpses from another world. This is the single largest death event tied to anything Morty ever asks for, and it begins with something as small and ordinary as a middle school crush. The girl at the center of all this is named Jessica. She goes to school with Morty, and he has liked her for a long time without ever having the courage or the opportunity to actually get her attention. When Morty finds out there is a school dance coming up, he sees a chance to finally make something happen between them. Rather than trying to talk to her the normal way, or work up the nerve to ask her out like anyone else might, Morty turns to the one person in his life who can make almost anything possible with enough science and enough disregard for consequences. He goes to Rick and asks for help. Rick agrees to make Morty a love potion. This is already a strange place to start, since using a chemical to force someone's feelings is nothing like an honest connection. But Rick does not seem bothered by that at all. He mixes something using a small amount of vole DNA, some kind of rodent-like creature from wherever Rick gets his supplies, and hands Morty a serum meant to make Jessica fall for him the moment it takes effect. Morty, excited and a little nervous, plans to use it at the dance without giving much thought to how risky or reckless the whole idea really is. What nobody accounts for is the fact that Jessica happens to be sick with the flu on the night of the dance. This detail seems small at first, almost like a joke the story is setting up, but it turns out to be the single most important piece of the entire disaster that follows. The chemicals inside the love potion end up mixing with the flu virus already inside Jessica's body. Instead of simply making her feel attracted to Morty, the combination creates something far more contagious and far more dangerous. The virus starts spreading the love effect to other people around her, turning what was meant to be a private moment between 2 teenagers into the start of an outbreak. Within a very short amount of time, the effect spreads through the entire school. Everyone who is near Jessica begins falling under the same spell, becoming obsessed with Morty in a way that has nothing to do with real feelings and everything to do with infection. Morty goes from being a shy kid trying to get one girl's attention to being surrounded by an entire crowd of people whose minds have been taken over by a virus he unknowingly helped create. What should have been a small, awkward moment at a school dance turns into a full-blown crisis almost overnight. Rick and Morty quickly realize the situation is spiraling out of control and try to find a way to fix it before it spreads any further. Rick's solution is to create something that can counteract the effects of the potion, using a different kind of animal DNA this time, borrowed from praying mantises. The idea is that this new formula will act as a kind of antidote, canceling out the love effect and returning everyone back to normal. Instead, the mantis DNA reacts with the already unstable flu virus and creates something even worse. Rather than curing anyone, this new mixture turns everyone infected into human and mantis hybrids, creatures that no longer look anything like the people they used to be. Even more disturbing, these mantis people are shown to have a violent drive tied to their new nature, wanting to mate with Morty and then kill him once that is finished, which flips the entire crisis from something merely strange into something openly dangerous to Morty's own life. Rick, now desperate and clearly out of his depth, despite constantly acting like nothing can surprise him, tries one more fix. He puts together yet another chemical formula, hoping this one will finally undo the damage the first two attempts caused. Once again, the fix goes horribly wrong. Rather than reversing anything, this final formula pushes the infected population into an even more extreme transformation. The mantis people become grotesque, deformed monsters, twisted and mutated in ways that no longer resemble anything human or animal in a recognizable sense. The show gives these creatures a nickname inspired by a real film director known for making movies about bodies changing into disturbing new shapes. And from this point forward, the infected population of this entire world becomes known simply as the Cronenbergs. What makes this part of the story land so hard is the scale of it. This is not a handful of people affected. This is not one street or one neighborhood dealing with some contained accident. The infection spreads across the entire planet, turning what used to be an ordinary, functioning world into something closer to a nightmare. Streets that were once filled with normal daily life are now filled with monstrous, mutated beings who barely resemble what they once were. It is one of the most extreme and irreversible disasters that happens anywhere in the entire series, and it starts from something as small and human as a boy wanting a crush to notice him. Rick surveys the damage and comes to a conclusion that says everything about how he handles problems he cannot easily fix. Rather than trying to find some further solution, rather than staying behind to help the people who are now suffering because of decisions he personally made worse at every single step, Rick decides the smartest move is simply to leave. Not leave the neighborhood, not leave the city, leave the entire reality behind and start over somewhere else. Rick has the ability to search across the wider multiverse for other versions of Earth, other timelines almost identical to the one he and Morty are currently standing in the middle of. Using this ability, he manages to find a nearly perfect match, a different version of this same world where things went differently on this exact same night. In that other version, the alternate versions of Rick and Morty managed to find an actual working cure for the virus outbreak before it could spread out of control. The problem is that in doing so, both of those alternate versions ended up dying shortly afterward for reasons the show never fully explains in detail. Their world is safe, their people are fine, but the two of them, the Rick and Morty who belong there, are gone. Rick's plan is simple and deeply unsettling once it is laid out plainly. He and Morty are going to travel into that other dimension, quietly bury the bodies of their dead counterparts, and simply take their place. Nobody in that other family will know the difference, since these two are essentially identical in every physical and even personality-based way to the versions who used to live there. The people who live in this other Earth still have a Jerry, a Beth, and a Summer, and none of them will ever realize that the Rick and Morty now living with them are not the same two people who were there just hours earlier. Morty is horrified by this idea, but by this point there is no other option left. Staying behind means living the rest of their lives surrounded by monsters on a ruined world, abandoned by any real hope of rescue or repair. Leaving means saving themselves, but it also means abandoning every single person they actually know and love, including their own Jerry, their own Beth, and their own Summer, all of whom will be left behind on a planet that has been completely and permanently destroyed by the very virus Morty's request helps set in motion. They go through with it. Rick and Morty travel into the new dimension, and there, in the backyard of a house that looks exactly like the one they grew up in, they dig 2 graves and bury the bodies of the Rick and Morty who used to belong there. This scene carries an enormous amount of weight, made even heavier by the fact that Morty is not just burying strangers. He is burying versions of himself and his grandfather, physically identical people who lived almost the exact same life he did, right up until the moment things went differently between their 2 realities. Morty stands there staring at his own face on a lifeless body, forced to accept that he is about to walk into this dead boy's house, sit at this dead boy's table, and pretend to be a member of a family that is not really his own. The full weight of what happened does not stop with the graves. Back in the world they left behind, the original Jerry, Beth, and Summer are still alive. But their lives from this point forward are nothing like what they used to be. This version of Earth remains completely overrun by Cronenberg monsters, a world that has been permanently changed by the chaos Rick's failed experiments unleashed. The surviving Smith family members are forced to adapt to conditions almost nobody could have imagined only a day earlier. They end up hunting and eating the very Cronenberg creatures that used to be their friends and neighbors, just to survive in a landscape that no longer offers any normal way of living. This detail alone shows just how far-reaching the consequences of Morty's simple request for a love potion actually turn out to be. It is not just a bad night. It is the total collapse of an entire world's way of life, one that the family left behind has no choice but to endure without Rick or Morty there to help them. There is something particularly cruel about how casually this new life begins for the 2 people who escaped it. Once Rick and Morty settle into their new dimension, life mostly goes back to feeling normal again. The new Beth and the new Jerry go about their days completely unaware that anything strange has happened. From their point of view, nothing is different. Rick is still Rick. Morty is still Morty. Nobody in this replacement family has any idea that the 2 people living with them are not the same 2 who were there the day before, or that somewhere else, in a completely different version of this same world, 3 people who share their faces are struggling just to survive in the wreckage left behind. Morty carries the memory of all of this in a way that clearly affects him, even if the show does not dwell on it constantly moving forward. This event marks one of the very first moments where Morty is forced to confront just how far-reaching the consequences of Rick's mistakes, mixed with his own small personal wants, can actually become. He did not ask for a monster apocalypse. He did not ask to bury a version of himself in a stranger's backyard. All he wanted, at the very start of all this, was for a girl at his school to notice him at a dance. That single ordinary teenage desire ends up being the spark for the death of an entire civilization's way of life on that world, even if none of the actual deaths were things Morty directly caused with his own hands. This raises an important difference between this section and the 2 deaths covered earlier in this story. Crumbopulous Michael died because of an accident Morty caused directly. Fart died because Morty made an intentional, direct choice to pull a trigger. This event is different from both of those. Morty never harmed a single person here through physical action. He never fired a weapon, never crashed a ship, never made a violent choice of any kind. Instead, this entire catastrophe traces back to a request, a simple, understandable wish that any teenager might make, one that spiraled completely out of anyone's control the moment biology and bad luck got involved. The deaths and suffering that followed exist because Morty wanted something small and human, and because the people responsible for fixing the resulting mess kept making things worse with every attempt they tried. It also says something important about how differently Rick and Morty react to disaster on this scale compared to something smaller and more personal. When Morty accidentally killed Crumbopulous Michael, he was shaken and visibly upset. When he killed Fart on purpose, there was a quiet, heavy sadness in how he carried himself afterward. Here, faced with the destruction of an entire world and the abandonment of his actual family, Morty's reaction is somehow both larger and more repressed. He does not get a moment to fully process what just happened before he is expected to simply move forward, take on someone else's name, and act like nothing life-changing occurred. There is a numbness forced onto him by circumstance, since there is no time to grieve when survival depends on pretending to be someone else almost immediately. The scale of this event also reveals something about how these two characters approach mistakes differently. Morty wanted to fix a personal problem and never imagined it could grow this large. Rick, on the other hand, treats the eventual solution the exact same way he treats almost every serious problem he creates throughout the show. Rather than staying to face what he caused, rather than trying to help the people who are now suffering because of choices he personally made, he simply finds an escape route and takes it, treating an entire family's survival as replaceable as long as some version of them still exists somewhere in the wider multiverse. For Rick, there is always another version of things out there, always another reality close enough to slip into if the current one becomes too damaged to fix. For Morty, forced to go along with this logic despite clearly being disturbed by it, there is no such comfort. He knows exactly what was lost, exactly who was left behind, and exactly what he is walking away from every single day he continues living inside someone else's replacement family. This event ends up shaping so much of what happens later in the series, since it establishes early on just how easily Rick is willing to abandon entire realities once they stop being useful to him, and how willing Morty becomes, even reluctantly, to go along with those kinds of choices simply because there does not seem to be any better option available. It plants a quiet, uncomfortable seed that grows throughout the rest of the show. The idea that no home, no family, and no version of reality is ever truly permanent once Rick is involved. For now, though, this replacement family, sitting comfortably in their new dimension with no idea what actually happened to the people who used to live there, becomes the version of the Smith family the story follows moving forward. Morty walks through their door every day carrying a secret nobody else in that house will ever know. Somewhere behind him, in a world he chose to leave, three people who share his exact face are still out there, surviving among monsters, waiting for a rescue that is never going to come. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Before any of this happened, though, back when things were still simple enough that Morty's biggest worry was passing a school dare rather than mutated monsters or dead versions of himself in a backyard, there was one earlier night where Morty faced a very different kind of threat. It happened in a place that looked friendly and safe on the outside, hiding something far more dangerous underneath. Something that would test Morty in a way nothing before it ever had. Section 4. King Jellybean. Not every death in this story comes from an alien encounter or a science experiment gone wrong. Some of them happen in much smaller, more personal settings, in places that look completely ordinary until something terrible happens inside them. This is the case with King Jellybean, a character who starts out looking like a harmless, oversized fairy tale figure and ends up being one of the most disturbing threats Morty faces anywhere in the entire series. His death is different from anything covered so far, not because of how large or small the scale is, but because of what leads up to it and what it reveals about how far Rick is willing to go to protect his grandson. This story begins with something that feels almost light-hearted at first. Morty has grown tired of the kind of adventures Rick usually drags him into, ones that are frightening, chaotic, and often life-threatening in ways that leave him traumatized by the end. He tells Rick he does not want to go on any more trips unless they can be simple, calm, and actually enjoyable for once. Rick, never one to back down from a challenge, offers Morty a deal. If Morty can pick out an adventure himself, one that Rick agrees to go along with no matter what, and Morty manages to see it through to the end without giving up, then Morty earns the right to choose future adventures going forward. If Morty backs out early for any reason, though, he loses that right completely and has to accept whatever Rick decides to do from that point on. Morty agrees to the bet, excited by the idea of finally having some say in how these trips go. He picks something that sounds simple and safe on the surface. Using one of Rick's devices, Morty selects an adventure inside a fantasy world, the kind of place filled with castles, medieval villages, and simple folk who need help from outside heroes. It looks like something straight out of a storybook, complete with a small, struggling town that Rick and Morty are asked to assist. The idea is that they will help this village solve some kind of problem, likely find a way to bring wealth or resources to people who are clearly living in poverty, and then leave once the job is done. It sounds like exactly the kind of low-stakes, wholesome trip Morty was hoping for. Things start off well enough. Rick and Morty end up dealing with a separate threat first, a giant creature that has apparently been causing trouble in the area. The two of them manage to defeat this giant, but rather than being celebrated for it right away, they are actually placed on trial for killing it, since apparently there are rules in this world about how giants are supposed to be treated, even when they pose a danger to others. Rick and Morty are eventually let off the hook on a technicality, since it turns out nobody ever properly informed the giant of its legal rights before the fight took place, which is exactly the kind of oddly specific, bureaucratic joke this show loves to use even in the middle of a fantasy setting. With that strange trial behind them, Rick and Morty decide to celebrate by stopping into a tavern, a cozy-looking inn filled with villagers enjoying food and drinks after a hard day. This is where the tone of the episode shifts completely, moving from a light-hearted fantasy parody into something much darker and more uncomfortable. While inside the tavern, Rick and Morty end up frustrated with each other over something small, and Morty, upset, storms off toward the bathroom to get some space and cool down after the disagreement. It is inside that bathroom that Morty encounters someone who will become one of the most disturbing figures in the entire history of this show. At first, this character appears friendly and comforting. He is a giant, cheerful-looking figure shaped like an oversized jelly bean, and he seems to notice that Morty is upset. He approaches Morty in a way that seems, at first glance, kind and understanding, almost like someone offering a shoulder to lean on during a rough moment. This gentle demeanor does not last long. Very quickly, his behavior shifts into something aggressive and predatory, and he attempts to sexually assault Morty inside that bathroom stall. Morty fights back. Despite being caught off guard and clearly terrified, he manages to defend himself physically, using a piece of the bathroom fixtures, specifically the heavy lid from the top of a toilet tank, as a weapon. He strikes his attacker with it again and again, hitting him hard enough and often enough to leave him severely beaten and bloodied, forcing him away and ending the attack before it can go any further. Morty escapes the bathroom shaken, visibly traumatized, and unable to fully process what just happened to him in those few terrifying minutes. When Morty finds Rick again, he is a different person than the boy who stormed off in frustration only a short while earlier. He is quiet, shaken, and desperate to leave. He tells Rick he wants to go home immediately, even admitting outright that he is willing to lose the bet they made, giving up his right to choose future adventures just to escape this place as fast as possible. This alone tells you how deeply what just happened has affected him. Morty cared about winning that bet. He wanted the chance to pick adventures going forward. In this moment, none of that matters to him anymore. He just wants to leave. Rick, despite his usual carelessness and his tendency to brush off almost everything with sarcasm, notices immediately that something serious has happened. He does not need Morty to explain the details out loud. He can see it in Morty's face, in his shaking hands, in the way he flinches and rushes his words. Rick puts the pieces together on his own, understanding that whatever just occurred in that bathroom was bad enough to completely shatter the calm, easy trip Morty had been hoping for. Rather than pressing Morty for details or forcing him to relive what just happened by explaining it out loud, Rick handles the situation in his own way. He decides the money he won earlier from playing cards inside the tavern should go to the villagers, offering it as a kind of gift before they leave. This decision ends up mattering a great deal, because the villagers, thrilled and grateful for this unexpected generosity, declare Rick and Morty heroes on the spot and insist on introducing them to someone important. They want Rick and Morty to meet their king, the ruler of this entire village, as a way of honoring what they believe was an act of pure kindness. The king turns out to be the exact same figure who attacked Morty in the bathroom only a short while earlier. This reveal lands with a heavy, sickening weight. The villagers have no idea what their beloved ruler is truly capable of. They see him as a benevolent leader, someone worth celebrating and thanking outsiders in front of. Morty, standing there having just survived an assault at this same person's hands, is now expected to smile, shake hands, and pretend everything is fine in front of a crowd that has no idea what almost happened only minutes earlier inside that tavern bathroom. Morty cannot bear to stay in that moment for even a second longer than necessary. He immediately turns to Rick and asks him to open a portal so they can leave right away, unable to hide his panic at being face to face with his attacker again, this time surrounded by people who see that same man as some kind of hero and protector. Rick agrees without hesitation, and the two of them step through a portal to leave this world behind entirely. What happens next is where this section earns its place in this story. Just as Rick and Morty are stepping through the portal, seemingly on their way out for good, Rick reaches back through with his arm, still holding the device that opened the portal in the first place, now fitted with a weapon. Without saying a word about it beforehand, without asking Morty for permission, or even warning him it is about to happen, Rick fires a shot back through the portal, striking the king directly and killing him instantly. The shot is powerful enough to destroy him completely, leaving nothing behind but the aftermath of the blast. This moment is quiet in a way that makes it even more effective. Rick does not make a speech about justice. He does not explain his reasoning out loud or turn it into some kind of teaching moment for Morty. He simply does it, calmly, without hesitation, as though it is the most natural response in the world to what he now understands happened to his grandson. It is one of the clearest examples in the entire series of Rick showing real, direct protectiveness over Morty, expressed not through comforting words or emotional conversation, but through immediate, decisive violence aimed at the person responsible for hurting him. This death is different from every other death covered so far in this story. Crumbopulous Michael died by accident. Fart died through a difficult but understandable choice Morty made himself. The Cronenberg disaster happened because of a request that spiraled completely out of anyone's control. This death is neither an accident nor a moral dilemma. It is a direct, intentional act of retaliation, carried out by Rick on Morty's behalf in response to something genuinely evil that was done to him. There is no ambiguity here about who deserved what happened to them. The only real question left is how to categorize whose kill this actually is. The physical harm inflicted on the king happens in two separate stages, and both of them matter. The first stage happens inside that bathroom, where Morty, defending himself out of pure necessity and terror, beats his attacker badly enough with the toilet tank lid to leave him visibly injured and bleeding by the time he stumbles back out into the tavern. Morty does not kill him in that moment, but he does real, serious damage, enough that Rick immediately notices something violent has taken place just by looking at the man's condition afterward. The second stage happens later, through the portal, when Rick finishes what Morty started, delivering the fatal shot that actually ends the king's life for good. Because of this, the death of King Jellybean is often understood as a shared kill between Morty and Rick, even though neither one of them acts at the exact same moment. Morty's beating weakens and injures him first, born entirely out of self-defense during an assault Morty never asked for and never saw coming. Rick's shot finishes the job afterward, delivered as an act of protection and revenge once he understands what actually happened to his grandson. Neither part of this story exists without the other. Morty's violence in that bathroom is what first marks this man for death, and Rick's violence through the portal is what actually carries that ending through to completion. There is something worth sitting with in how this entire event unfolds without a single word of explanation passing between Rick and Morty. Rick never asks Morty directly what happened in that bathroom. Morty never has to describe it out loud. The entire exchange happens through body language, through silence, through the simple act of Rick noticing his grandson's fear and acting on it without demanding details first. In a show that often uses dialogue to explain jokes, references, and scientific concepts at a rapid pace, this particular sequence stands out precisely because of how little is actually said. This event also reveals something important about how the show chooses to handle deeply upsetting subject matter. Rather than lingering on the assault itself in graphic detail, the story moves quickly through it, focusing instead on Morty's reaction, his desperation to leave, and Rick's eventual response once he understands the situation. The horror of what almost happened to Morty is communicated through consequence and atmosphere, rather than through extended focus on the act itself. And the story ends this particular thread firmly and permanently the moment Rick fires that shot through the portal. There is also a small, disturbing detail revealed after the king's death that adds another layer to just how dangerous this figure truly was. Following his death, a statue erected in his honor is shown standing in the village square, meant to celebrate him as a beloved and generous ruler. When someone discovers a box among his belongings containing what are clearly troubling images involving other children, the officials who find it choose to destroy the evidence rather than let the truth come out, deciding the villagers are better off believing in the false, heroic version of their king rather than learning what he actually was. This detail confirms that the attack on Morty was not some isolated, out-of-character moment. It was part of a much longer, hidden pattern that the villagers around him never had any idea about, protected by his position and his public image right up until the moment Rick ended his life without any of them ever finding out how or why. This section stands apart from everything else in this list because it is not really about strategy, mistakes, or moral dilemmas the way the earlier deaths were. It is about protection, plain and simple. Morty did not choose this fight. He did not walk into that bathroom looking for trouble or looking to prove anything about himself. He was targeted. He defended himself as best as he could in a moment of pure fear. And his grandfather finished the job the second he understood what had actually happened. Out of everything covered so far, this is the clearest example in the entire series of violence used purely as a response to protect Morty, rather than as a result of some larger plan or accident spiraling out of control. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. For a while after this, the show moves away from anything quite this dark, returning to the kind of chaotic, science-based adventures that usually define these two characters. But threats do not always come from strangers in fantasy worlds or dangerous aliens picked up along the way. Sometimes the most disturbing dangers come from somewhere far closer to home, hidden inside familiar faces that Morty has known and trusted for years, waiting for the exact right moment to reveal themselves as something else entirely. Section 5. The Total Recall Parasite Purge. Some threats in this family's life come from outside forces crashing into their world without warning. Others come from something far sneakier, something that slips inside the house itself and hides in plain sight until nobody can tell who around them is actually real. This is exactly what happens during one particular morning at the Smith household. A morning that starts out looking completely normal and ends with the family shooting their way through their own living room, trying to figure out which of the people standing in front of them actually exist and which ones are nothing more than an invading parasite wearing a friendly face. The trouble starts with something small and easy to miss. Earlier, during the same adventure where Morty killed Krombopolis Michael and Fart, Rick picked up some strange rocks from the ground without paying them much attention. These rocks appear to be nothing important at the time, Just another piece of alien debris Rick grabs out of habit during one of his trips. What nobody realizes is that these rocks are actually filled with eggs belonging to a species of parasite capable of taking over an entire household without anyone noticing until it is far too late. By the time the family sits down for breakfast one morning, the parasites have already hatched and gone to work. The Smiths are gathered around the table with Jerry's older brother, someone named Uncle Steve, who apparently has been living with them for the past year. There is a comfortable, familiar energy to the scene, the kind of morning routine any family might have with a relative who has become part of the household. Uncle Steve even mentions that he bought everyone plane tickets as a way of thanking them for letting him stay so long. A small gesture that fits perfectly with how established and normal his presence feels to everyone sitting at that table. The problem is that Uncle Steve does not actually exist. Jerry has never had a brother. Nobody in this family has ever met this person before this exact morning. Yet somehow, every single person sitting at that table has full, detailed memories of him being part of their lives for an entire year. This is the core trick used by these particular parasites. Rather than disguising themselves physically or sneaking around unnoticed, they implant entirely false memories directly into the minds of everyone nearby, creating a version of the past that feels completely real to the people experiencing it, even though none of it actually happened. Rick walks into the kitchen partway through this cheerful family breakfast and immediately reacts differently than everyone else in the room. He does not recognize Uncle Steve at all. To Rick, this is a total stranger sitting at his family's table, and he says so bluntly, confused about who this person even is. The rest of the family reacts with disbelief, insisting that Rick must be joking or forgetful, since, as far as they are concerned, Uncle Steve has been a normal part of their lives for a long time now. Rick, unconvinced and clearly suspicious, pulls out a weapon and shoots Uncle Steve without much hesitation. As soon as the shot lands, Uncle Steve's body changes right in front of everyone, transforming from the friendly relative they all remembered into the true form of the parasite underneath, a strange, snake-like creature completely unlike the human disguise it had been wearing only seconds earlier. Rick explains what just happened to the rest of the shaken family. These creatures are a species that survives by embedding fake memories into people's minds, growing in number as more of them attach themselves to a household and convince everyone that they have always belonged there. Rick lays out a simple fact meant to anchor everyone during the confusion that is about to follow. There should only be 6 people who actually belong inside this house: himself, Morty, Summer, Beth, Jerry, and a small, strange-looking creature the family affectionately refers to as Mr. Poopy Butthole. Anyone beyond that number is not real. To keep any more of these creatures from getting inside, Rick seals the house using a defensive barrier, hoping this will trap whatever parasites are already inside while blocking any new ones from joining the chaos. Almost immediately, though, another supposed memory surfaces. Mr. Poopy Butthole reminds everyone of a cousin named Nikki, someone the family apparently spent time with before. And just like with Uncle Steve, this memory feels completely real and detailed to everyone experiencing it. Nikki appears in the room only moments later, seemingly confirming that this memory must be true. Rick, checking his own private list of the 6 real family members, realizes Nikki does not belong on it either, and shoots him without hesitation. This pattern begins repeating itself over and over throughout the episode, and each time it happens, the fake memories feel just as convincing and detailed as the ones before them. More and more strange characters begin appearing throughout the house, each one accompanied by warm, specific memories that the entire family seems to share collectively, despite none of these memories ever having actually happened. The living room slowly fills with a growing crowd of unfamiliar faces, each one insisting, through the shared false memories embedded in everyone's minds, that they have always been part of this family's life in one way or another. One of the strangest and most memorable of these fake additions is a character the family comes to know as Sleepy Gary. According to the memories suddenly shared by everyone in the room, Sleepy Gary is somehow connected to Beth in a romantic sense, despite the fact that Beth is already married to Jerry. This creates an extremely uncomfortable and confusing dynamic, since everyone in the room suddenly seems to remember Sleepy Gary being a natural, accepted part of the family structure, blurring lines that should never have been blurred in the first place. Jerry, in particular, ends up affected by a separate false memory, suggesting he is secretly involved in a hidden relationship with another one of these invented characters, adding even more confusion and emotional strain to an already chaotic situation. The parasites eventually realize that shooting them one by one is putting their numbers at serious risk, and they shift their strategy in a much more dangerous direction. Rather than simply hiding among the crowd of fake memories, several of the parasites work together to plant a new memory targeting Rick himself, convincing Morty, Beth, and Summer that Rick is actually one of the invading creatures, rather than a real member of the family. This is a clever and deeply threatening move, since it turns the family's own defense mechanism against the one person who has been leading the effort to identify and eliminate the fakes in the first place. Morty, now convinced by this planted memory that Rick is the true threat hiding among them, is selected by the rest of the family to be the one who actually eliminates him. He takes Rick to a separate part of the house, weapon in hand, fully prepared to follow through on what he now believes is the necessary and correct decision. Standing there, ready to act, Morty is faced with a moment that could have completely changed the entire outcome of this crisis had he gone through with it based on nothing but a memory that was never actually real. It is in this exact moment that Morty finally figures out the flaw in how these parasites actually work. He realizes that this entire species is only capable of creating positive, pleasant memories inside people's minds. Every fake character introduced throughout the episode, including Uncle Steve, Nikki, and Sleepy Gary, came attached to warm, happy memories that made everyone feel good about their presence. Morty stops to think about his actual history with Rick. And unlike the memories tied to all these invented characters, his memories of Rick are filled with plenty of negative moments, fear, frustration, danger, and outright trauma sprinkled throughout years of chaotic adventures together. If Rick were truly a parasite trying to implant a false, positive history, none of those painful memories would exist at all. This realization saves Rick's life in that moment. Morty lowers his weapon, understanding now that the difference between real family members and fake ones lies specifically in whether or not someone carries unpleasant memories about them. Real people leave behind complicated histories filled with both good and bad experiences. The parasites, unable to create anything but pleasant illusions, always leave gaps where negative memories should exist. Rick, upon hearing Morty explain this discovery, immediately runs with the idea, treating it as though he had already figured this out himself, despite clearly not having reached that conclusion until Morty said it out loud first. With this new method in hand, the family begins working through the crowd of parasites filling their living room using this simple test. Anyone whose presence is tied only to pleasant, happy memories gets identified as fake and eliminated. Anyone who comes with a mixture of good and bad memories, proof of a real, complicated relationship built over actual time, gets confirmed as genuinely belonging in the family. Morty plays a direct role in this process, taking part in shooting several of the remaining parasites as the family works through the room together, clearing out the fake characters one after another using the method he discovered. Summer helps confirm her own authenticity during this process in an unusual way, remembering a specific and slightly embarrassing memory of walking in on Morty at an inappropriate moment. A memory far too awkward and unpleasant to have been created by a parasite trying to make itself seem likable. This small, uncomfortable detail actually becomes proof of her being real, since no parasite trying to blend in would ever choose to implant something so embarrassing into someone's mind. In a strange way, embarrassment and pain become the very things that prove someone truly belongs. Beth ends up facing one of the harder moments during this process when she kills Sleepy Gary, after finally confirming through this same method that he must be one of the parasites rather than a genuine part of her life. This particular kill hits Jerry especially hard, since the false memory tied to Sleepy Gary had convinced him that Beth was involved in some kind of relationship outside their marriage. Watching Beth kill Sleepy Gary sends Jerry into a spiral of despair, and in a moment of genuine emotional collapse, he begs Beth to kill him too, believing that everything he thought he knew about his marriage might somehow be based on more fake memories he cannot trust. Beth refuses, understanding that Jerry's pain in this moment, however messy and confused, comes from something real rather than something implanted by the parasites. By the time the house finally clears out, the family is left with exactly the 6 people Rick identified at the very beginning of the crisis, sitting down together for what should be a much-needed, calm dinner after surviving such a chaotic and confusing morning. It is at this dinner, though, that the story delivers its final and most unsettling twist. Beth looks across the table at Mr. Poopy Butthole, the small, strange creature who has apparently been part of this family for a long time, and realizes something troubling. She has no negative memories of him at all. Every single memory she has involving Mr. Poopy Butthole is warm, pleasant, and happy, with nothing uncomfortable or painful mixed in anywhere. Using the exact same test that saved Rick's life earlier in the episode, Beth concludes that Mr. Poopy Butthole must be a parasite as well, since a real relationship built over real time should have at least some rough patches or unpleasant moments buried somewhere inside it. She shoots him at the dinner table, expecting his true form to emerge the same way it did with every other fake character eliminated throughout the day. Instead, nothing changes. Mr. Poopy Butthole does not transform into a strange alien creature. He does not reveal some hidden true form underneath a disguise. He simply bleeds, screaming in genuine pain, exactly the way a real, living person would after being shot. It becomes horrifyingly clear in that instant that Mr. Poopy Butthole was never a parasite at all. He was simply someone the family had never had a single negative experience with. A rare and unusual case of a relationship built entirely on kindness and positivity, without ever including any of the painful moments that usually come with knowing someone over a long period of time. This revelation lands as one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire episode. After spending an entire morning carefully testing every character based on the presence of both good and bad memories, using this method with total confidence to justify killing dozens of fake characters throughout the house, the family discovers that their own test has a serious flaw. One that led directly to shooting the one person among all of them who is actually completely innocent and real the entire time. Beth immediately regrets what she has done and tries to visit Mr. Poopy Butthole afterward to apologize for the mistake, but he refuses to speak with her, offering only a quiet, painful comment about how sad it is that she does not have any bad memories of him, a small detail that once protected him and ended up being the very reason he almost lost his life. Morty's role throughout this entire ordeal fits into a much bigger pattern building across every section of this story so far. Once again, he finds himself directly involved in violence, carried out with confidence and good intentions, believing at every step that he is doing the right thing based on the information available to him. He nearly kills his own grandfather because a false memory convinced him it was necessary. He personally shoots several genuine parasites once he figures out the correct method for identifying them. None of this happens out of malice or carelessness. It happens because Morty, just like the rest of his family, is doing his best to survive a situation specifically designed to confuse and manipulate everyone's sense of what is real. What makes this particular section stand apart from everything covered earlier in this story is the setting itself. There is no alien assassin here, no fantasy kingdom, no love potion spiraling out of control across an entire planet. This entire crisis takes place inside the family's own home, using their own memories and their own trust in each other as the primary weapon against them. The most dangerous thing Morty faces in this section is not a physical threat at all. It is the possibility of being tricked into hurting someone he loves simply because his own mind has been convinced that something false is actually true. By the end of this chaotic morning, the house returns to something resembling normal, minus one badly injured, deeply hurt member of the family, who now has every reason never to trust them the same way again. The 6 people who belong in that house have been confirmed, painfully and imperfectly, through a method that almost failed them at the very last moment. Life eventually moves forward the way it always seems to in this family, without much time spent dwelling on how close things came to going even worse than they already did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every dangerous situation Morty finds himself in involves figuring out who around him is real. Sometimes the real danger comes from something attached directly to his own body, something completely outside his control, guiding his actions toward violence for reasons that have nothing to do with memories, love potions, or hidden parasites at all. Section 6. The Armathy Killing Spree. Beth and Jerry's marriage is falling apart. That is where this section actually starts, with a family cracking down the middle, rather than with anything alien, magical, or strange. Morty and his sister Summer are both dealing with the fallout of their parents separating, carrying around anger and sadness they do not really know how to process. Rick, never particularly skilled at handling emotions the normal way, decides the best fix for 2 upset grandkids is to yank them out of their own reality entirely and drop them somewhere far away from the situation. He takes Morty and Summer to a different version of Earth, one that has already been through some kind of massive disaster and turned into a dry, dangerous wasteland. Nothing about this place resembles the world they grew up in. The land is cracked and barren, and the people who survived whatever destroyed this version of the planet have organized themselves into rough, violent groups just to stay alive. Almost as soon as the 3 of them arrive, a band of scavengers calling themselves the Death Stalkers spots them and gives chase. Rick did not pick this destination at random. He noticed that the Deathstalkers are carrying a valuable material called Isotope 322, and he wants it for himself. Rather than avoiding this group entirely, Rick decides joining up with them is the smarter play, giving him a chance to get close enough to steal the isotope without drawing too much suspicion. Before that plan can really get going, Summer ends up killing the group's original leader, which creates an opening at the top of the Deathstalkers that someone else quickly fills. That someone is a large man wearing a rusted bucket-shaped helmet who calls himself Hemorrhage. Rather than being angry about the death of the previous leader, he thanks Summer for it, framing the killing as something that removed weakness from the group and made everyone stronger. Summer, drawn to the raw, consequence-free lifestyle of this wasteland, starts forming a real connection with Hemorrhage almost immediately, finding in him a kind of comfort that has nothing to do with her parents' divorce back home. While Summer settles into this new relationship, Morty ends up on a completely different path within the same wasteland. He is thrown into something called the Blood Dome, a violent fighting arena where combatants battle each other while a crowd watches and cheers. Morty is about as far from a natural fighter as a person can be, so putting him in a place like this should be a serious problem. Rick solves it in the strangest way available to him. He gets his hands on a severed arm that once belonged to someone else entirely, someone who died somewhere in this wasteland, and transfers the muscle memory stored inside that arm directly into Morty's own left arm. The result is unsettling right from the start. Morty's arm suddenly moves with the strength, speed, and fighting instinct of a completely different person, almost as if it belongs to someone else even while still attached to Morty's body. It does not wait for Morty's permission before acting. Inside the blood dome, this arm takes over almost entirely once the fighting begins, throwing punches, blocking hits, and taking down opponents with a level of skill Morty has never shown in his life. Morty stands there horrified at first, watching his own limb move on its own, brutally defeating fighter after fighter while the crowd roars with approval around him. Eventually, Morty gives the arm a name, calling it Armathy, treating it almost like a separate person sharing space inside his own body. What starts as horror slowly shifts into something more complicated. Morty begins to lean into what Armathy is doing rather than fighting against it, using the violence happening through his own arm as an outlet for all the anger and frustration he has been carrying since his parents' divorce began. It becomes easier to let this borrowed rage take over than to sit with his own painful feelings about his family falling apart back home. Armathy is not simply a violent reflex with no history behind it. As Morty spends more time connected to this arm, pieces of its past start coming through. Before ending up as nothing more than a severed limb in this wasteland, Armathy belonged to a woodcutter living a quiet, ordinary life in a small village. That peaceful existence was destroyed when invaders swept through the village, killing his wife and children and torturing him before he was eventually left for dead or killed outright. Whatever happened to the rest of his body afterward remains unknown, but his arm survived somehow, carrying with it every ounce of grief and fury from watching his family taken away from him in the cruelest way imaginable. This backstory changes how the fighting inside the blood dome feels. Armathy is not just randomly aggressive. Every strike thrown, every opponent defeated, is fueled by a specific kind of pain. A father and husband desperately trying to release rage that never got a proper outlet before his own life ended. At one point inside the arena, Armathy recognizes someone directly connected to what happened to his family. A soldier responsible for what was done to that village. This recognition sends Armathy into an even more furious state, chasing this specific target down and killing him. A kill driven entirely by personal revenge that has been sitting unresolved since long before Morty's arm was ever attached to it. With this piece of unfinished business partially addressed, Armathy still is not satisfied. It becomes clear that the soldier killed inside the blood dome was not the person ultimately responsible for what happened to Armathy's family. He was simply someone following orders, a smaller piece of a much larger picture. The real target Armathy wants is the person who actually gave the command to destroy that village in the first place, someone higher up, who never had to get his own hands dirty carrying out that kind of cruelty. Morty finds himself pulled along on this next stage of the mission, whether he wants to be there or not. Armathy communicates with him in a simple way, since the arm cannot exactly speak out loud. Morty asks yes or no questions and interprets the arm's movements as answers, essentially having a one-sided conversation with a body part that has its own goals completely separate from anything Morty actually wants for himself. Through this strange method of communication, Morty comes to understand that Armathy's revenge is not finished yet, and that finishing it seems to be the only thing that will eventually let this borrowed rage settle down. The two of them, Morty and Armathy together, sneak into a castle belonging to the person responsible for ordering the destruction of Armathy's village. Along the way, two guards confront them, and Armathy makes short work of both of them, killing them quickly without much resistance. Morty is present for this, standing right there while his own arm ends 2 more lives, though at this point he has mostly stopped trying to fight against what is happening and has instead settled into simply going along with wherever Armathy leads him next. Inside the castle, they find the man responsible sitting in a bathtub, being tended to by servants while treating them with the kind of casual cruelty that suggests this is exactly the sort of life he is used to living. He owns other people as workers, forcing them to serve his every need without any concern for their well-being, and he speaks to them with contempt even in this relaxed, private moment. It becomes clear fairly quickly that this man comes from wealth and comfort, someone who has never had to fight or suffer the way the people in this wasteland below him are forced to every single day. He sent his own servants to burn down Armathy's village and murder his family, treating that entire act of destruction as nothing more than routine business. When Morty bursts into the room with Armathy attached to his arm, the man reacts with fear mixed with a strange kind of resignation, telling Morty that killing him will not change anything at all, as though trying to talk his way out of consequences using pure detachment rather than actual remorse. Morty, still mostly a passenger in his own body at this point, tells the man honestly that he is really just along for the ride here, admitting that he agrees with plenty of what this man might be about to hear regarding how wrong his actions were, without necessarily wanting to be the one delivering the punishment himself. Armathy does not wait for any further conversation. The arm begins choking the man, applying pressure with a strength completely disconnected from anything Morty's own body could normally produce. While this is happening, Rick, who has been present nearby holding some vials related to his own separate reasons for being in this wasteland, casually comments that he can wait for this moment to finish playing out, treating the entire scene with the same detached patience he might use while waiting for someone to finish a phone call. Morty, distracted by everything happening around him, tells Rick it is already too late for waiting anyway, since Armathy has clearly already committed to finishing this. The choking continues, and at one point, Armathy pushes the man's head underwater inside the bathtub he was originally found relaxing in, drowning him slowly while Morty watches, caught somewhere between horror and acceptance of what is unfolding in front of him. The man eventually loses consciousness under the water, and it looks, at least for a moment, like Armathy has finally gotten the revenge it spent this entire adventure chasing after. There is one more twist buried inside this ending that makes the whole sequence even stranger than it already is. Once the deed appears finished, Armathy suddenly disappears from Morty's arm entirely, the borrowed presence simply fading away as though its purpose has finally been fulfilled and there is nothing left keeping it attached to Morty's body. Morty is left standing there with his own normal arm again, freed from the weight of carrying someone else's unfinished revenge. The problem is that Armathy left too soon. It turns out the man drowned in the bathtub is not actually dead yet when Armathy disappears, merely unconscious rather than deceased. This leaves Morty and Rick in an unusual position, technically finishing a job that Armathy believed was already complete. Rather than letting the moment go unresolved, Rick and Morty together finish what Armathy started, making sure the man responsible for destroying that village does not survive this encounter after everything that led up to this point. This final act ties Morty directly to the man's actual death, in a way that goes beyond simply being present while his own arm did the choking earlier. Whatever finishing blow occurs after Armathy vanishes involves both Rick and Morty acting together, ensuring the revenge that drove this entire storyline actually reaches its conclusion, rather than leaving the target alive after everything that was done to get to this point. While all of this violence is unfolding in the wasteland, back on regular Earth, Rick has been dealing with a separate problem tied to keeping this whole trip a secret from Beth. Since Morty and Summer refused to come home when Rick first tried pulling them out of the wasteland, Rick built robotic copies of both of them to fool Beth into thinking everything at home is normal. These robot versions of Morty and Summer behave in a strangely well-adjusted, cheerful way, which ends up backfiring on Rick's plan. Rather than reassuring Beth that everything is fine, the robot's unusually calm behavior actually makes her start questioning her decision to divorce Jerry in the first place, since these fake versions of her children seem to be handling everything so much better than she expected real kids going through a divorce ever would. This forces Rick back into the wasteland to retrieve the real Morty and Summer before the fake versions cause any more confusion at home. By the time Rick catches up with them, Morty has already been through the entire Blood Dome experience and the confrontation inside the castle, while Summer has spent her time deepening her relationship with Hemorrhage and settling comfortably into the Death Stalker lifestyle. Neither one of them is particularly eager to leave this wasteland behind, having found something in this harsh, simple version of survival that feels more manageable than facing their parents' divorce back home. Rick eventually manages to get through to both of them, though not through any grand emotional speech. He simply keeps pushing and chasing them down until they finally give in and agree to head back home. Before leaving the wasteland entirely, Rick and Morty help the Deathstalkers use the isotope Rick originally came here to steal, upgrading their entire community into something resembling a modern, suburban-style society almost overnight. This transformation ends up ruining exactly what drew Summer to this place in the first place, since Hemorrhage quickly settles into a comfortable, apathetic lifestyle once his violent, nihilistic wasteland existence gets replaced with modern comforts and routine. Watching the man she fell for turn into someone who spends his days simply sitting around, Summer finally agrees it is time to leave, taking the isotope back with Rick just before they head home for good. Morty's arm remains entirely his own again for the rest of this adventure, the borrowed rage and grief of a dead stranger finally settled after everything that happened inside that castle. What stays with Morty afterward is less about the fighting itself and more about how easily he let another person's fury guide his actions once his own emotions became too much to sit with. He did not choose most of what happened in that blood dome or that castle. He simply stopped resisting it, letting Armathy's revenge become an outlet for his own pain about his parents splitting apart, until the two of them, borrowed anger and personal grief tangled together, ended up finishing a job that was never really Morty's fight to begin with. Back home, life slowly starts returning to something resembling normal, though the divorce between Beth and Jerry remains an unresolved weight hanging over the family. Morty carries with him the strange memory of watching his own arm take multiple lives on someone else's behalf, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing about him is not his own choices at all, but what happens when he simply stops trying to make any choices and lets something else take the wheel completely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every dangerous situation Morty ends up in comes from something attached to his body or hiding inside his own home. Sometimes it comes from an object built specifically to help him fix his mistakes, a tool meant to give him a second chance at doing things right. One that ends up revealing just how far Rick is willing to let Morty go before finally showing him the real cost hiding behind every single one of those supposed do-overs. Section 7. The Vat of Acid episode. Rick and Morty are in the middle of a crystal exchange with a group of alien gangsters when everything falls apart. This deal was supposed to be simple, a straightforward trade of valuable crystals for money. But the gangsters betray Rick partway through, turning what should have been a quiet transaction into a life-or-death situation inside the factory where the meeting is taking place. Rick has a backup plan ready for exactly this kind of scenario. He fakes his own death and Morty's death by having them both jump into a large vat filled with what appears to be acid. The trick relies on hidden compartments built into the bottom of the vat, along with small hatches that let Rick and Morty sink down and hide, while fake bones, carefully carved beforehand to look like the remains of a person dissolving in acid, float up to the surface and convince anyone watching that both of them have actually died. It is an elaborate, carefully planned ruse, the kind of overly complicated scheme Rick seems to enjoy building even when a simpler escape might work just as well. The gangsters who betrayed them do not immediately leave after seeing what looks like Rick and Morty melting away in the vat. Instead, they linger around, taking their time to reflect on what just happened, discussing their feelings about watching a grandfather and his grandson apparently die together in such a horrifying way. This extended period of standing around, mourning, and talking becomes a serious problem for the two people actually hiding beneath the surface of the fake acid, since the entire plan depends on the gangsters leaving quickly enough that Rick and Morty can climb out unnoticed. Morty is the one who eventually breaks first. As the minutes drag on and the gangsters continue their unhurried conversation, Morty grows impatient waiting at the bottom of the vat. Rather than continuing to wait quietly for the gangsters to finally walk away on their own, Morty decides enough time has passed and rises up out of the fake acid himself, revealing that the whole death scene was staged. This decision forces Rick's hand completely, since the ruse is now blown regardless of what happens next. With the deception exposed, violence becomes the only option left. Rick ends up killing the gangsters directly, but the responsibility for this outcome does not sit entirely on his shoulders. Morty is the one who chose to end the waiting game early, revealing that they were both alive and forcing a confrontation that could have been avoided entirely if he had simply stayed patient a little longer. Once the ruse is blown, Morty rises out of the acid himself and takes part in dealing with the gangsters directly, no longer just a bystander hiding at the bottom of a tank, but an active participant in the fight that follows. This entire sequence sets up the emotional core of what happens next between Rick and Morty. Once they are safely back home, Morty cannot let go of how badly this whole plan bothered him. He tells Rick directly that the vat of acid idea was a bad one, criticizing his grandfather for relying on something so overly complicated and risky just to fake a simple escape. Morty goes further than just criticizing this one plan, accusing Rick of never taking any of his ideas seriously in general, suggesting that Rick dismisses everything Morty comes up with without giving it any real consideration. Rick, stung by this accusation, pushes back by challenging Morty to actually produce a better idea, instead of just complaining about the ones Rick already has. Morty responds with something he has clearly been thinking about for a while. He suggests that people should have some kind of save point, similar to something someone might find in a video game, a way to return to an earlier moment and try again if something goes wrong or someone dies, rather than being forced to live with every single consequence permanently. It sounds harmless on the surface, even reasonable given how often things go horribly wrong during their adventures together. Rick, annoyed and clearly feeling pressured to prove that he does take Morty's ideas seriously after all, ends up actually building this device. He hands Morty a special remote, one supposedly capable of resetting events and giving Morty exactly the kind of second chances he was asking for. Morty takes the remote without waiting around for Rick to fully explain how it works or what its actual limitations might be, eager to start using this new tool right away. What follows is a long stretch where Morty uses this remote constantly, treating his life like something with an undo button built in. He begins committing all sorts of small crimes and pulling pranks without any fear of consequences, since every time something goes wrong or he regrets a choice, he simply presses the button and resets things back to how they were before. This behavior escalates over what feels like an extended period of time, with Morty growing more comfortable acting recklessly the more he relies on this supposed safety net. During this stretch, Morty eventually falls into a relationship with a girl, developing real feelings for her over the course of repeated resets and adjustments to how their interactions play out. This part of the story stands in sharp contrast to everything else happening around it, since it represents something genuine and emotionally meaningful growing out of what otherwise looks like a consequence-free spree of bad decisions. Morty seems to believe that because he can always reset things if something goes wrong, none of his actions actually carry any real weight, allowing him to explore this relationship and his other choices without ever worrying about permanent damage. Eventually, Morty comes back to Rick with something that sounds like genuine reflection and growth. He explains that he has learned an important lesson through all of this. Living without consequences is not actually a good thing, he tells Rick, since it is the consequences of choices that shape who a person becomes and give those choices any real meaning in the first place. It is a mature realization, one that suggests Morty has grown from this entire experience, understanding now that constantly resetting his mistakes robbed those experiences of anything that could have actually mattered. This is exactly the moment Rick chooses to reveal the truth behind how this device actually works. and the reveal completely destroys the lesson Morty thought he had just learned. Rick explains, with a certain amount of satisfaction in proving his point, that the remote never actually reset anything at all. There was no rewinding time. There was no returning to an earlier moment to try again. Every single time Morty pressed that button, believing he was getting a fresh start, what actually happened was far more disturbing. The device teleported Morty into a parallel dimension almost identical to his own, and in doing so, it killed the version of Morty who already existed in that dimension, allowing the Morty holding the remote to slide into that dead Morty's place and continue on as though nothing unusual had happened. This means every single reset Morty performed throughout his entire spree of reckless behavior actually ended another version of himself's life. He was never getting a second chance at anything. He was simply moving from one dimension to the next, leaving a trail of dead, alternate Mortys behind him every single time he pressed that button, believing the whole time that he was simply undoing the stakes rather than ending lives. Rick even compares what happened to a well-known story about a magician who duplicates himself repeatedly while performing a trick, killing off different versions of himself each time in pursuit of pulling off something impressive. The comparison lands hard, since it strips away any comfort Morty might have found in believing his actions were harmless. Every crime he committed without worry, every prank he pulled without fear, every moment spent building that relationship with the girl he grew close to, all of it came at the cost of a different version of himself dying somewhere else. Someone who had built his own separate life in that dimension before Morty's arrival ended it completely. Morty is horrified once he understands the full scope of what actually happened. This is not a small revelation to sit quietly with. He has been responsible, without ever realizing it, for the deaths of numerous alternate versions of himself, each one erased the moment he decided he needed a fresh start rather than dealing with whatever mess he had just created. The very tool he asked Rick to build specifically because he wanted to avoid causing permanent harm ended up causing exactly that, over and over again, hidden behind a comforting lie about resets and second chances. Rick, watching Morty struggle with this discovery, offers what sounds like a solution, but ends up making the situation significantly worse. He suggests merging all of these alternate universes together into one single timeline, combining everything that happened across every version Morty passed through during his reckless spree. Morty, desperate for some way to fix what he has done, agrees to this plan, hoping that merging everything back together might somehow undo the damage, or at least bring some kind of resolution to the chaos he unknowingly caused. The merge does technically undo the deaths of those alternate Mortys, at least in the sense that they are no longer simply gone and forgotten. But it comes with a serious cost of its own. Once everything merges into a single reality, every single person from every one of those different dimensions who witnessed or knew about Morty's various crimes and reckless behavior now exists together in this same combined timeline, and all of them remember exactly what happened. This means an enormous number of people, including law enforcement figures, victims, and various other groups affected by Morty's actions across all those different dimensions, are now aware of everything he did, and none of them are happy about it. An angry mob quickly forms, made up of people from every merged dimension who have legitimate reasons to be furious with Morty, and they descend on the Smith household, demanding that he face consequences for everything he has done. This is a direct and immediate result of trying to fix the earlier mess through merging, showing that Rick's proposed solution simply traded one problem for another rather than actually resolving anything cleanly. With an angry crowd surrounding their home, Rick offers Morty only one way out of the situation. He needs to fake his death one more time, jumping into another vat of acid, echoing the exact same trick that started this entire chain of events back at the beginning of the episode. Morty, having no better option left available to him, agrees to go through with it, even though he clearly resents having to rely once again on the very idea he criticized so harshly earlier in the story. There is a final layer to this ending worth noting, since it changes how the entire spree Morty went on should be understood. Morty jumps into this final vat without realizing that the girlfriend he grew close to during his reckless period, the one relationship in all of this that felt genuinely meaningful rather than reckless or careless, is watching him fake his death, and thanks to the earlier merge, she now remembers everything about who he really is and what he actually did. The comfort Morty found in believing his relationship with her was separate from all the chaos and irresponsibility surrounding it turns out to be another illusion, since she now carries full knowledge of everything he did throughout his entire spree. Rick, satisfied that his point has been thoroughly proven, reveals one more twist before the episode wraps up completely. The entire ordeal, from the original vat of acid deal gone wrong at the very beginning, through every reset, every alternate dimension, every death of another Morty, took place inside an alternate dimension rather than their actual home reality. Rick explains that he specifically avoided using their real home dimension for any of this, since he did not want to waste it purely for the sake of proving a lesson to Morty about consequences. This final detail adds an uncomfortable wrinkle to everything that happened throughout this entire section. Rick allowed Morty to spiral through an extended, reckless spree, resulting in the deaths of numerous alternate versions of himself, purely as an elaborate demonstration meant to teach a lesson about the importance of consequences. Rick never stepped in to stop any of it while it was happening, never explained the true nature of the device before Morty had already caused so much unintended damage, and only revealed the truth once Morty had already spiraled deep enough into his reckless behavior for the lesson to land with maximum impact. Looking at everything that unfolds across this section, Morty's connection to death here is completely different from anything covered in the earlier parts of this story. He does not kill anyone through direct intentional action the way he did with Fart. He does not cause destruction through an innocent request the way he did with the love potion disaster. Every single death tied to Morty throughout this entire spree happens without his awareness, hidden behind a comforting lie about second chances that made it feel like nothing he did actually carried any real weight or cost. He believed the entire time that he was simply getting to try things again. In reality, he was ending one version of his own existence after another, each time convinced he had found a clever way around consequences that were actually happening anyway, just somewhere he could not see them. The gangsters killed at the very start of this section stand apart from everything that follows, since their deaths happen through a much more straightforward chain of events. Morty grows impatient, waiting inside of that, pretending to be dead, decides to reveal himself before the gangsters have actually left, and that impulsive choice forces a violent confrontation that results in their deaths. It is a smaller, more contained moment compared to the sprawling multiverse consequences that follow later in the same episode, but it still ties directly back to a choice Morty made, this time driven simply by a lack of patience rather than any larger plan or deeper motivation. Taken together, this entire episode paints one of the more unsettling pictures of how easily consequences can hide behind convenience. Morty wanted an easy way out of dealing with mistakes and asked for exactly that, never stopping to question what such a tool might actually cost someone else in order to work the way he hoped it would. Rick built the device, knowing full well what it actually did, choosing to let Morty discover the truth only after he had already caused significant harm, treating the entire ordeal as a teaching moment worth the damage it caused along the way. By the time this section ends, Morty is left carrying the knowledge that somewhere out there, across a string of alternate dimensions, versions of himself lost their entire lives simply so he could avoid sitting with the discomfort of his own choices for a little while longer. It is a heavy thing to carry, made even heavier by the fact that nobody forced him into any of it directly. He asked for the tool that caused all of it, used it eagerly once he had it in hand, and only understood the true cost after the damage had already been done many times over. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every dangerous situation Morty finds himself pulled into comes from something built with good intentions gone wrong. Sometimes, the danger comes from a place that is supposed to exist purely to release pressure and let people act out their worst impulses safely. A place with its own strange set of rules about what counts as acceptable behavior for one single chaotic night. Section 8. The Purge. Planet Rampage. Rick and Morty are flying through space when something small and messy interrupts their trip. An interstellar insect smacks into the windshield of their ship, smearing across the glass in a way that makes it hard to see. Rick tries to clean it off, but instead of fixing the problem, wiping at the smear only spreads it further, making visibility even worse than before. Frustrated, Rick decides the simplest solution is to land on a nearby planet and find some washer fluid to properly clean the mess off the windshield. The planet they choose to land on looks calm and peaceful at first glance. The people living there come across as friendly, almost old-fashioned in how they talk and carry themselves, similar to a small rural town where everyone seems to know everyone else. As Rick and Morty wander around trying to find supplies, they start picking up on some strange details about how this society actually works. The locals mention something referred to simply as the festival, describing it in a way that makes it sound like a normal, expected part of their yearly calendar, even though the actual details of what happens during it remain vague at first. It eventually becomes clear that this festival is essentially a purge, a single night each year where every single law gets suspended completely, including laws against murder. For this one night, anyone on the planet is allowed to do whatever they want to another person without facing any legal consequences afterward. The locals talk about it with a strange kind of comfort, treating it as just another part of life rather than something horrifying. The same way someone might talk about a holiday tradition back on Earth. Rick's reaction to learning about the purge is almost gleeful. Rather than being disturbed by the idea of an entire night dedicated to legal violence, he seems excited by the novelty of it, treating the whole concept as an interesting cultural quirk worth sticking around to observe. Morty reacts completely differently. He is horrified by the idea from the moment he understands what the festival actually involves, telling Rick clearly that he does not even want to witness it, let alone take part in anything happening during it. Before the purge officially begins, Rick and Morty end up crossing paths with a lighthouse keeper, someone living alone at a lighthouse who happens to be working on a screenplay in his spare time. This character wants feedback on his writing, and what follows becomes an example of the kind of small, personal friction that ends up mattering a great deal once the purge actually starts. The Lighthouse Keeper's script turns out to be unoriginal and poorly written, filled with ideas that feel copied from other stories rather than anything fresh or interesting. Morty, still processing his frustration over everything happening around him, ends up giving the Lighthouse Keeper honest, critical feedback about the screenplay. Rather than taking this criticism well, the Lighthouse Keeper responds with a passive-aggressive attitude, clearly annoyed and defensive, despite having asked for feedback in the first place. This small moment of tension between the two of them seems minor at the time, the kind of awkward social friction that might happen anywhere, completely disconnected from anything related to violence or the purge itself. That tension does not stay contained for long. When the Lighthouse Keeper reveals that he cannot help Rick and Morty send a signal back home from his lighthouse, framing this refusal with the same irritating, passive-aggressive energy he showed earlier, Morty's frustration finally boils over. He pushes the Lighthouse Keeper down a set of stairs inside the lighthouse, and the fall kills him. This moment stands apart from many of the other deaths covered earlier in this story because of how ordinary the motivation behind it actually is. Morty does not kill this man because of some elaborate plan gone wrong, a mistaken identity, or a desperate need to prevent some larger disaster. He kills him because he is annoyed, irritated by someone's attitude, in a moment where his patience has already worn thin from everything else happening around him. It is a small, petty reason for someone to lose their life, and the fact that it happens on the same night as the purge, when doing exactly this kind of thing carries no legal consequences at all, makes it feel disturbingly convenient rather than accidental. With the festival now officially underway across the rest of the planet, Rick and Morty decide the smartest move is to simply rise up into the clouds and watch the chaos unfold safely from a distance, rather than getting involved directly. This puts them in the position of spectators for a while, observing violence happening below them without directly participating in it themselves. Rick, ever the more emotionally detached of the two, seems to find the whole spectacle entertaining at first, treating it almost like a strange kind of nature documentary playing out beneath their ship. Even Rick eventually reaches a limit. After witnessing something particularly brutal happening on the ground below, he tells Morty he has seen enough of the purge for one night, visibly shaken by whatever violence just occurred. This detail matters because Rick rarely reacts this way to anything. Throughout the entire series, Rick tends to remain unbothered by extreme violence and death, treating both as background noise given how much of it he has witnessed across countless different realities. The fact that something happening during this particular purge manages to disturb even Rick says something about just how extreme the violence unfolding below them actually is. While all of this is happening, a separate situation develops involving a young woman named Arthricia. Earlier, before the purge officially began, Morty had insisted on trying to rescue her while she was being chased by attackers, showing early signs of the same instinct to protect and help others that shaped his actions back during the night Fart and Crumbopulous Michael died. Arthricia ends up stealing Rick's ship at one point and shooting him during this earlier encounter, complicating what should have been a straightforward rescue attempt. Later, once they actually get a chance to talk with her properly, Arthricia reveals an important detail about why the purge exists on this planet in the first place. According to her, the tradition is not something the general population created or benefits from equally. It exists because a group of wealthy elites within this society wanted a way to keep poorer people fighting and killing each other, distracting them from focusing their anger toward the systemic problems actually causing their hardship in the first place. This detail adds a layer of social commentary to the entire situation, framing the purge as something less like a natural cultural tradition and more like a tool deliberately created to benefit those already in power. Arthricia eventually leads an effort to fight back against this ruling class directly, and by the end of the episode, she manages to overthrow them entirely, ending their control over the rest of the population. The story does take time to point out that even removing the ruling elite does not automatically fix everything wrong with this society, since the underlying social problems that made the purge possible in the first place still exist regardless of who happens to be in charge. Back with Morty, things take an even darker turn once he ends up drugged with something called purginol, a chemical hidden inside a candy bar that amplifies violent tendencies in whoever consumes it. This detail becomes important later, since it gives Rick a convenient excuse to explain away everything Morty does during the rest of the night, suggesting that the chemical, rather than Morty himself, is responsible for whatever violence follows. Once affected by this candy, Morty is confronted by a group of purgers looking to attack him directly. Rather than simply trying to escape or defend himself in a limited way, Morty completely loses control, snapping into a state of pure aggression that leads him to kill every single member of the group attacking him. This is not a quick, contained burst of self-defense. Morty continues the violence well beyond the point where the immediate threat has already been neutralized, reaching a point where he is described as shooting corpses, continuing to attack bodies that are already dead simply because his rage has not yet run its course. This moment marks one of the most disturbing shifts in Morty's behavior seen anywhere in this entire story so far. Every previous death connected to him carried some kind of clear reasoning behind it. Whether that reasoning involved an accident, a moral dilemma, self-defense, or simple impatience. This one is different. Once the drug takes hold and the fighting begins, Morty does not stop at neutralizing the threat in front of him. He continues well past that point, driven by something closer to pure, uncontrolled rage than any specific goal or justification. Rick, once the immediate danger has passed and Morty's rampage finally winds down, tries to smooth over what just happened by offering an explanation meant to reassure everyone, including himself, that nothing about Morty's actual character has changed. He insists that none of what just occurred reflects who Morty really is, blaming everything entirely on the effects of the candy bar containing Purginol, treating the chemical as the sole reason behind such an extreme and prolonged burst of violence. This explanation, however, gets complicated by everything else that happened earlier in the same night. Morty killed the lighthouse keeper before ever eating that candy bar, before any chemical influence entered his system at all. That earlier death happened purely because of ordinary human irritation, nothing more complicated than one person losing patience with another person's attitude. If the Purginol is truly responsible for explaining away Morty's later rampage against the group of attackers, it does nothing to explain why he was already willing to push someone down a flight of stairs hours earlier, well before any drug was involved. This contradiction sits at the center of what makes this particular section stand apart from the others covered so far. Rick's attempt to excuse Morty's behavior by pointing entirely to the chemical ignores the fact that violence was already present in Morty that night, before any outside substance ever touched him. The show seems to deliberately leave this contradiction unresolved, suggesting that perhaps everyone, including someone as fundamentally kind-hearted as Morty usually appears to be, carries some capacity for violence that simply needs the right circumstances or the right amount of provocation to come rushing out into the open. By the time the night finally ends, the ruling elite responsible for creating the Purge tradition in the first place have been overthrown, thanks to Arthricia's efforts. The lighthouse keeper lies dead at the bottom of his own stairs, and an entire group of attackers who cornered Morty have been killed well beyond what any reasonable definition of self-defense would require. Rick and Morty prepare to leave this planet behind, having gotten their washer fluid and witnessed far more than either of them expected from what started as a simple errand to clean a bug smear off a windshield. What lingers after this particular night is less about any single death and more about the uncomfortable question hanging over the entire episode. Morty spent the earlier parts of this same story insisting that killing is wrong, showing genuine distress every single time violence touched his life in any way. Here, given the right combination of irritation, opportunity, and eventually a chemical push, that same boy ends up responsible for multiple deaths in a single night, some explainable through outside influence, and one that cannot be explained away by anything except his own frustration boiling over at exactly the wrong moment. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every kind of danger Morty faces involves other people at all. Sometimes the most unsettling threats come from somewhere far stranger, tucked inside a place that looks nothing like reality itself, riding on rails through a world built entirely out of stories rather than anything solid or real. Section 9. The Story Train Ticket Collector. Rick and Morty find themselves aboard a train unlike anything either of them has ever traveled on before. It looks ordinary enough at first, filled with passengers sitting in different compartments, each one seemingly on their way somewhere specific, telling stories to pass the time during the ride. What neither of them realizes right away is that this train is not just a normal mode of transportation. It is something closer to a living structure built entirely around the idea of storytelling itself. And the passengers riding it are not simply travelers, but pieces of an anthology, each one carrying a tale meant to be told before the journey ends. Rick and Morty are disguised among these passengers at first, blending in without drawing attention to themselves. As they move through the train, they begin to piece together what is actually happening around them. The whole vehicle functions as a kind of engine for producing stories, with each passenger contributing something to the overall structure just by being present and sharing their own experiences with whoever happens to be sitting nearby. It becomes clear fairly quickly that this is not a normal situation they simply need to wait out. Something deliberate is guiding events on this train, and Rick, always sharp about noticing when he is being manipulated, starts looking for a way to understand exactly what that something is. Rick draws on his own understanding of how stories are typically built, using a method he knows well from experience, trying to speed up their progress toward whatever lies at the front of the train. He reasons that no journey worth telling comes without difficulty along the way, which means the only way forward involves leaving the safety of their current compartment and pushing ahead through whatever obstacles stand between them and the front of the train. Standing directly in their path is the ticket collector, a figure whose job on this train involves checking passengers and making sure everyone belongs where they are supposed to be. Physically, this character is far more powerful than either Rick or Morty expected, built with an intense amount of muscle that makes him a serious threat the moment things turn physical between them. Rick and Morty, despite working together, struggle badly against him. The fight quickly turns one-sided. The ticket collector breaks Rick's leg early in the confrontation, leaving him in serious pain and unable to fight back effectively for the rest of the struggle. Morty tries to step up and take over the fight himself, attempting to catch the ticket collector off guard, but this does not go well either. The ticket collector easily turns the tables on him, overpowering Morty just as thoroughly as he already overpowered Rick only moments earlier. With both of them losing badly and Rick unable to stand properly because of his broken leg, he comes up with a desperate solution to end the fight before it gets any worse. Rather than continuing to try to beat the ticket collector through direct combat, something that clearly is not working, Rick shoots a hole into one of the windows inside the train compartment they are fighting in. This action causes the air inside the compartment to rush out through the opening, pulling anything nearby toward the hole with tremendous force. Because the outside of this train exists in a strange kind of space that does not follow the normal rules of the story taking place inside the train itself, this space outside the windows is considered non-canon, essentially existing outside the actual narrative structure the train represents. The ticket collector gets caught in this sudden rush of escaping air and gets pulled through the hole Rick just created, sucked out into that strange non-canon space surrounding the train. This effectively removes him from the fight immediately, since he is no longer inside the compartment where Rick and Morty are struggling to survive. From Rick's perspective, this solves the problem entirely. The threat is gone, the fight has ended, and there is no reason to think about the ticket collector any further once he disappears through that opening into the space outside. The reality of what actually happens to him afterward paints a much darker picture. Rather than dying quickly or simply vanishing the moment he leaves the train, the ticket collector ends up slowly dying out there in that strange, non-canon space surrounding the train. He does not disappear painlessly. He lingers, suffering, stuck in a kind of limbo, existing outside the actual story taking place inside the train, slowly running out of whatever he needs to survive, while nobody inside the train pays him any more attention. Morty is the one who eventually notices this ongoing suffering, and his reaction says a lot about who he is, even in the middle of a chaotic, high-stakes situation happening elsewhere on the train. Rather than simply moving on and treating the fight as finished the same way Rick does, Morty recognizes that the ticket collector is still out there, still alive in some capacity, still experiencing whatever pain comes with slowly dying in that strange space outside the train's normal boundaries. This recognition weighs on him enough that he decides something needs to be done about it, even though the fight itself is technically already over and there is no practical reason left to deal with the ticket collector at all. Motivated by sympathy rather than any remaining danger, Morty shoots the ticket collector, ending his suffering rather than letting him continue to slowly die out in that isolated, non-canon space surrounding the train. This is not an act of aggression or self-defense in any traditional sense. There is no threat left to neutralize by this point, since the ticket collector has already been removed from the fight entirely once he was pulled through that window. Morty pulls the trigger purely because he feels bad about leaving someone to suffer slowly when a quicker, more merciful ending is available to him instead. This moment fits into a pattern that has already shown up once before in this story, back when Morty made the choice to end Fart's life after learning about the threat his species posed to every carbon-based life form in that dimension. Both moments share something important in common. In each case, Morty is not acting out of panic, anger, or confusion about what is happening. He understands the situation clearly, weighs what is in front of him, and makes a deliberate choice to end a life specifically because he believes doing so is the more compassionate option available given the circumstances. With Fart, the motivation involved preventing something far worse from happening to countless other people. Here, with the ticket collector, the motivation is much simpler and more personal. Morty just does not want another being to keep suffering when there is an easy way to stop that suffering immediately. What makes this particular death different from almost everything else covered throughout this story is the setting it happens inside. Every other death examined so far takes place within something resembling a normal, physical reality, even when that reality involves aliens, alternate dimensions, or strange creatures unlike anything found on Earth. This death happens inside something explicitly built as a metaphor, made literal, a living representation of storytelling itself rather than any kind of grounded physical world. The train exists specifically as a structure for generating narratives, and the ticket collector, in a strange sense, exists as a piece of that structure, rather than simply another character wandering through a normal setting the way Crumbopulous Michael or King Jellybean did earlier in this story. This distinction matters because it changes how this particular death should be understood compared to everything that came before it. The earlier sections of this story all deal with beings who exist within recognizable versions of reality, whether that reality involves alien planets, fantasy kingdoms, or wastelands built from destroyed versions of Earth. This section deals with something existing purely within a structure built around narrative itself. A character whose entire purpose ties directly into keeping the story's rules intact, rather than living an independent life the way other characters throughout this list clearly do. Despite that difference, the emotional weight of Morty's choice does not feel any less real within the story itself. The show treats this moment with the same seriousness it treats Morty's earlier mercy killing of Fart, framing his decision as coming from genuine compassion rather than convenience or carelessness. Morty does not celebrate ending the ticket collector's suffering. He does not treat it as an achievement or a moment of growth. He simply makes the call because leaving someone to suffer slowly, even someone who was moments earlier trying to seriously hurt him and Rick, feels wrong to him once the immediate danger has already passed. With the ticket collector no longer standing in their way, Rick and Morty continue pushing forward through the train, eventually needing to disrupt something referred to as a thematic seal, blocking their path further into the structure. Morty manages to get past this obstacle by telling an unrelated story of his own, specifically involving his sister Summer and their mother Beth fighting off scorpions using devices tied to their menstrual cycles. This strange, specific detail becomes the key that allows them to move past the seal and continue their journey toward the front of the train, showing just how literally this entire setting treats the mechanics of storytelling as something that can be manipulated and worked around using the right kind of narrative material. Eventually, Rick and Morty reach the engine compartment at the very front of the train, where they finally come face to face with the figure responsible for everything happening around them. This character, known as the Story Lord, reveals a plan far larger than anything either Rick or Morty anticipated going into this confrontation. He intends to drain both of them of what he refers to as their story potential, using their combined creative energy to power the train enough that it can push beyond the boundaries of the actual show itself, breaking through what the story refers to as the fifth wall. The Story Lord easily overpowers both Rick and Morty once the fighting starts, showing a level of strength that makes the earlier struggle with the ticket collector look minor by comparison. He captures them both, binding them in place so he can begin extracting the story potential he claims to need. What follows is a series of possible future scenarios pulled directly from Rick and Morty's own potential, showing glimpses of events that could happen later in their lives, including a dramatic confrontation involving armies made up of Meeseeks, Citadel guards, and other threatening figures gathered together for one final battle. Rick manages to find a way out of this situation, not through violence, but through a strange kind of narrative trick of his own. He tells Morty about Jesus Christ, framing this sudden religious detour as something meant to derail the story Lord is trying to force them into. This unusual choice actually works, slowing the entire story train down to a halt and drawing an angry story lord directly into the scenario being played out, at which point Jesus himself actually appears within the story. Using this bizarre turn of events, Rick and Morty manage to escape back through a portal leading out of that scenario, leaving the story lord trapped inside it instead, stuck in what the story refers to as every writer's worst nightmare, permanently stranded inside the pages of the Bible with no way out. Rick and Morty believe at this point that they have successfully solved the mystery of the train and can finally return home safely. Reality has one more twist waiting for them before this entire ordeal actually ends. When they try to operate the train's control panel, expecting it to take them back to their actual lives, Rick discovers that the panel itself is fake, nothing more than a prop rather than something capable of actually controlling anything real. The full truth comes out shortly afterward. This entire elaborate adventure, the train, the passengers, the ticket collector, and even the story lord himself, has been taking place inside a toy model train set the whole time. Something small and physical sitting inside the actual Smith household, rather than any kind of real external location Rick and Morty traveled to. This reveal changes how everything that happened throughout this entire section should be understood. The ticket collector's death, along with everything else that occurred aboard that train, happened within the confines of a toy, a physical object existing inside Rick and Morty's own home the entire time they believed they were dealing with some vast external threat tied to the nature of storytelling itself. Once this truth comes out, the story lord, now trapped inside his own strange scenario after explaining certain details about the nature of reality directly to Jesus, ends up breaking the actual toy train itself, bringing the entire physical object to a final, definitive end. This detail adds a layer of strangeness to Morty's mercy killing of the ticket collector that none of the earlier deaths in this story carry. Every other death examined so far happens within something the characters themselves clearly understand as real, whether that reality involves aliens, alternate dimensions, or dangerous strangers encountered during ordinary adventures. This death happens within a toy, a physical object existing inside the very house Morty calls home, blurring the line between what counts as a genuine loss of life and what might simply be an elaborate piece of imaginative play given enough strange rules and internal logic to feel completely real while it was happening. Whether or not the ticket collector's death should be understood the same way as the other deaths covered throughout this story remains an interesting question the show itself never fully answers one way or another. What stays consistent, regardless of how literally any of this should be taken, is Morty's behavior throughout the entire ordeal. He treats the ticket collector's suffering as real enough to deserve a merciful ending, choosing compassion over simply walking away and letting the moment pass without any further thought. Whether that suffering existed inside some larger structure built around storytelling itself, or inside a toy sitting quietly in the corner of a garage, Morty's reaction to witnessing it remains the same, driven by the same instinct that guided his choice regarding fart much earlier in this same overall pattern of behavior. By the time this entire ordeal wraps up, Rick and Morty find themselves back in their actual home, the strange adventure aboard the story train fully resolved, the toy responsible for the entire experience now broken beyond repair thanks to the story lord's own actions before everything came to an end. Life continues normally from this point forward, without much further discussion about what exactly happened during those strange hours spent believing they were trapped aboard a living structure built entirely out of narrative itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every threat Morty faces comes from something as strange and layered as a train built from stories or a toy hiding an entire alternate world inside it. Sometimes the most dangerous thing waiting for him is something far more ordinary looking on the outside, disguised as a familiar face from school, hiding something monstrous underneath a role that should have felt completely safe. Section 10. Coach Ferratu, the Vampire Gym Teacher. Rick decides to try something different for a day, transferring his own mind into the body of a teenage clone he creates for himself, someone the family quickly starts calling Tiny Rick. The idea behind this experiment is fairly simple. Rick wants to experience being young again for a short while, planning to enjoy himself for a day before switching back into his actual body once the novelty wears off. This decision ends up connecting to something happening at Morty and Summer's school that has nothing to do with Rick's experiment at all, though the two storylines end up crossing paths before the day is finished. At breakfast earlier that morning, Jerry asks his kids if anything interesting has been happening at school lately. Morty mentions, almost as a passing comment, that one of the lunch ladies working at their school was recently found dead. Her body was discovered completely drained of blood, with 2 distinct puncture marks left behind on her skin. This detail is delivered with a strangely casual tone, as if a dead body showing clear signs of a vampire attack is simply another odd thing worth mentioning during a normal family breakfast, which fits the pattern of how this family tends to treat even disturbing news without much alarm. Beth reacts with shock and confusion to this information, unable to understand how something like this could happen at her children's school. Rick, never one to treat strange news with much seriousness, responds by casually confirming that vampires are, in fact, real, treating this as common knowledge rather than something worth being frightened over. Summer is horrified by this casual confirmation, but Rick brushes off her fear just as easily, mentioning that people have known vampires exist for hundreds of years, framing the whole subject as old news rather than anything worth panicking about. With this background established, Morty and Summer head off to school while Rick continues enjoying his day inside his new teenage body. It becomes clear fairly quickly that the school itself is dealing with a real and ongoing threat tied to this vampire attack. Someone connected to the school, specifically their gym teacher, turns out to be the vampire responsible for what happened to the lunch lady, hunting inside the same building where students spend their days without any idea what is actually walking the halls alongside them. Morty and Summer end up directly involved in dealing with this threat themselves, working together to track down and confront the gym teacher once they understand what he actually is. Using wooden stakes, the traditional weapon associated with killing vampires in most stories about them, the two siblings manage to kill him, ending the threat he posed to anyone else at their school. This moment is confirmed directly within the episode itself, referenced afterward through dialogue between the characters. Specifically, when one of them jokes about the fact that they killed both a vampire and a separate gym teacher in what amounts to a 2-for-1 situation, tying the vampire directly to the identity of a staff member working at their school. This kill stands apart from nearly everything else covered throughout this entire story because of how little dramatic buildup surrounds it. There is no long chase, no emotional dilemma weighing on Morty beforehand, and no elaborate explanation walking through every step of the confrontation in detail. The vampire threat exists mostly in the background of an episode primarily focused on Rick's experiment with his teenage body, treated almost like a minor subplot happening alongside the main story, rather than something given its own dedicated spotlight. Morty and Summer simply identify the threat, deal with it directly, and move on with their day without much further discussion about what just happened. What makes this particular death interesting within the larger pattern established throughout this story is how ordinary the setting feels compared to almost everything covered earlier. There is no alien planet, no alternate dimension, no fantasy kingdom, and no strange metaphorical structure built entirely out of narrative rules. This happens inside Morty's own school, involving someone who held a position of authority and trust among the students there every single day. A gym teacher is supposed to be someone reliable, someone tasked with looking after students' safety during physical activities, not someone secretly hunting and killing people within the same building where he is supposed to be protecting them. This detail connects loosely to something touched on earlier in this story, back when King Jellybean was revealed to be someone the villagers trusted and celebrated despite hiding something monstrous underneath that public image. Coach Ferratu fits a similar pattern in a smaller, more contained way. He held a position that should have made him someone students could rely on, yet he was secretly responsible for at least one confirmed death within the very community he was supposed to be part of. The difference here is that Morty and Summer figure this out and act on it far more quickly than anything resembling the earlier situation with King Jellybean, dealing with the threat directly rather than needing an elaborate sequence of events to expose what was actually happening underneath the surface. Summer's involvement alongside Morty in this particular kill also fits a pattern worth noting across several sections of this story. Throughout different adventures covered so far, Morty rarely acts entirely alone when violence becomes necessary. Rick has been directly involved in several of these deaths, whether finishing something Morty started or standing nearby while events unfolded. Here, it is Summer standing beside him instead, the two siblings working together to handle a threat that neither one of them likely expected to face on what should have been an otherwise normal day at school. Their partnership in this moment shows a kind of quiet competence between the two of them, handling a serious, potentially dangerous situation without needing Rick's direct involvement or guidance to see it through. The show never dwells on this particular event for very long, choosing instead to keep its main focus on the more elaborate storyline involving Rick's experiment with his teenage clone and everything that spirals out of that decision as the episode continues. The vampire subplot exists almost as a quiet background detail, confirmed clearly enough through dialogue for anyone paying attention to understand exactly what happened, without ever needing a dramatic, drawn-out sequence dedicated entirely to walking through the kill itself. Looking back across every section covered throughout this entire story, Morty's relationship with death takes on many different shapes depending on the situation surrounding him. Sometimes it comes from pure accident, the result of inexperience colliding with bad timing in ways nobody could have predicted. Sometimes it comes from a difficult, deliberate choice made with full understanding of the consequences involved. Sometimes it happens because of something small and personal, spiraling completely out of control. Or because something attached directly to his own body acts with intentions that were never really his own. Sometimes it happens through simple frustration boiling over in an ordinary moment. And sometimes it happens purely out of compassion, ending someone's suffering rather than leaving them to face it alone. Coach Ferratu's death fits into this pattern as one of the most straightforward examples across the entire list. There is no moral confusion here, no accident, no elaborate scheme gone wrong. A dangerous threat existed inside a place that was supposed to be safe, and Morty, alongside his sister, dealt with that threat directly and effectively once they understood what they were actually facing. It stands as a quiet reminder that not every dangerous encounter in Morty's life needs a complicated explanation or a heavy emotional toll attached to it. Sometimes the danger is simple, the response is direct, and life at the Smith household moves forward the very next day as though nothing unusual happened at all. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.